Death and the Cornish Fiddler by Deryn Lake. Side 3. Once inside the other room, deserted except for an elderly gentleman scanning a paper, John came directly to the point. "Mrs. Pill, your daughter is terrorizing mine. She came into Rose's room, waking her up, and stood there silently staring at her. The unprepossessing features worked. Then she said, 'That is not possible, sir. I think your child is fabricating the whole story. Isabel sleeps in my room and was with me the entire night, but I saw her with my own eyes. After Rose told me what had happened, I waited in her room and heard the intruder for myself. I rushed to the door and witnessed your daughter disappearing up the corridor.'" Mrs. Pill's mouth tightened to a trap. "I cannot credit what you are saying, sir. You must have seen someone else. Isabel did not leave my side." It was hopeless, and John knew it. In the face of such a staunch denial, he had no option other than to make a stiff bow, bid the trio an abrupt good morning, and angrily withdraw. Chapter 5. To say that John was angry was understating the case. He fumed his way back to the breakfast room, banging the parlour door loudly behind him. Starting to speak to Elizabeth before he could even see her, he discovered to his chagrin that the room was empty. Standing for a moment or two, feeling utterly foolish, shuffling from one foot to the other, he eventually made his way out of the Angel and into the street. To the right of the inn stood an open courtyard, beyond which were the stables and coach-house. In the distance, the apothecary could see the Marchesa holding Rose's hand, talking to Jed the coachman, together with their guard Rufus. He started to make his way towards them, then stopped, intrigued by a well which stood in the stable yard. Its outer wall was about 3 feet in height, not nearly high enough in view of the well's enormous depth, which, when he peered down into the darkness, seemed to him to be about 40 feet. Indeed, it was so deep that it was impossible to glimpse the bottom. Above the well was a device for lowering buckets on a rope, at present hanging idly. Intrigued, John leant over once again, but even though he allowed time for his eyes to adjust to the darkness, he caught but the merest glint of the water below. "Trying to see the bottom, sir?" It was one of the inn's hostlers who spoke. "Yes, it seems very far down. That's 'cause the water level's low. It rises and falls according to the weather, you see." "Well, well," John answered, then realized what he had said, and grimaced. The hostler chuckled. "Ha! The old ones are always the best, sir." "Indeed." The apothecary straightened up from leaning on the wall. "Nice to speak with you, my friend. I'm always round the yard, sir, if you need to know anything about the old place. Worked here since I was a lad, like. We'll have a chat about it sometime, but presently I can see my friend and my daughter. Good day to you." "Good day, sir." They parted company, John joining Elizabeth. Rose immediately turned to her father. "What did she say, Papa?" "Nothing very much." He decided to be honest with the child. Actually, they denied everything. Said that Isabel did not stir all night. Rose went as red as the flower after which she was named. "But you saw her." "I know I did. I can't think why her mother is being so duplicitous." "Because she probably wasn't there with her. She was probably out with Mr. Painter." "You know, I think you're right," John answered. He smoothed Rose's curls, which in her agitation had started flying wild. "Anyway, I believe it best we forget it now. Let us speak of other things. Elizabeth, you are utterly right. We are here on holiday after all. So, sweetheart, what would you like to do today?" "Go in search of the monkey," John's daughter answered promptly, then looked puzzled when both her father and the Marchesa burst out laughing. They did see the blind fiddler's band, complete with its simian pet, quite frequently during the next 3 days. In fact, John thought, it was hard to avoid them. Wherever they went, either in the town or the surrounding countryside, they seemed to come across them, much to the delight of Rose. On the day before the Furry Dance, they set forth in the carriage to see the sea. It was only a short ride to the nearest point, Porthleven, and fortunately the day was fine. Rose was brimming with joy throughout the journey. John, watching her, felt a tug at his heartstrings that his late wife Emilia was not there to observe the child as she first glimpsed the vastness of the ocean. But he firmly thrust such ideas away, knowing that to dwell on the past would do neither him nor Rose any good. Instead, he shared his daughter's pleasure, hanging out of the carriage window beside her as the sea appeared in all its tumbling glory. "It's wonderful," breathed Rose. She pulled John's sleeve. "Why haven't I seen it before?" "Because we live in London. That's a long way from the sea." They abandoned the coach and made their way on foot to a wide cove where all three removed their shoes and paddled in the waves. Poignantly reminded of his honeymoon, which he and Emilia had spent in Devon, John remained somewhat quiet and withdrawn. But if Elizabeth noticed this, she said nothing, while Rose was too preoccupied with the sand and the shells and the snow-capped waves to be even aware of his silence. After a while, the two adults sat side by side on the damp shingle, while John's daughter played by herself. The apothecary sighed. Poor Rose. She could do with a companion. Elizabeth's black hair caught on the wind, and a big strand of it blew loose. "Well, no doubt you will provide her with one in time." "What do you mean?" "My dear, you are bound to remarry and have more children. You will meet somebody, have no fear." "I have already met her," John answered, leaning back on his elbows and watching Elizabeth through eyes narrowed against the sun. She turned to him, the expression on her face serious. "But, John, I have no wish to marry again. Oh, it's not because I still yearn for my husband. I've put those memories behind me years since. No. It is because now I am independent, and have been for such a long time that I could no longer bear the thought of sharing my life with another. Do you understand?" "No." "I've explained the situation to the best of my ability," the Marchesa said coldly. "I find what you say incomprehensible. Surely everyone wants to find a mate. You do, most certainly. But I would prefer to have you as a lover. Then there is no chance of you following me to London when I go." Elizabeth gazed out to sea, pulling the remaining strands of hair loose so that it blew round her face. "I will visit you for a season, but that is as far as the mood will take me." "Do I mean nothing to you?" asked the apothecary petulantly. She turned swiftly and kissed him full on the lips. "As much, if not more, than my husband, but it is I who have changed. Besides, I am older than you. You must find a young woman, John, a woman who can give you a family." "Why," thought the apothecary, "do I have to fall in love with such difficult women?" First, Coralie Clive, the actress, wedded to the theatre and not to a husband. Then Emilia Allain, who had loved another man until the time she met John, and now, the most confusing of them all, Elizabeth de Lorenzi, who was determined to follow her own path, and follow it alone. He sighed aloud, and the Marchesa laughed and tickled him under the chin. "There, John, be of stout heart. You are young yet." He got to his feet, rather inelegantly. "Come along. Time we went back." But Elizabeth was not paying attention, instead gazing out to sea. "What's that ship making for the beach?" John stared. "I'm not sure. But there's something about it I don't like the look of. I wouldn't be surprised if it was smugglers. Not landing goods in daylight, surely." Elizabeth gave him a loving look. "Oh, my sweet London boy, how innocent you are. The blackguards round this coastline are in charge of events. The number of law enforcers is pitiful compared with the smuggling gangs, which can number up to 100 strong. But I think you're right about that vessel. Let us be off." They called Rose, who came reluctantly, the pockets of her dress full of shells. Rapidly, John dried off her feet and put on her shoes and stockings. "We're going to explore, my darling, so please to hurry. "But I want to watch the ship that's coming in." "We can see that from further away. Now come along." Eventually, they dragged her away from the beach and made their way to the place where the fishermen's boats were moored. There were several boats tied up within its embrace, including a somewhat larger vessel than was customary. Elizabeth looked it over with a seasoned eye. "As I thought. I feel certain the fisherfolk have another, more lucrative way of making a living. Do you agree?" "I do, madam." "I spy a low-life alehouse further down the path. Would you be seen dead in such a place?" "I would, certainly. And to make my point, I reckon they serve some goodly spirits within." John chuckled, his good temper returning. "Then let us go and sample them." It was indeed a rough establishment. The place was thick with tobacco smoke, which had discoloured both walls and ceiling. Further, it was packed with disreputable characters who mixed freely with honest fishermen. From the beams were hanging various bottles and herbs, and for a minute John was reminded of his apothecary's shop and felt a moment's pang of nostalgia. Every eye turned to look at Elizabeth, probably the first woman ever to enter the place, and there were several growls and whistles of a lewd kind. John fixed the perpetrators with as dark a look as he dared, and bowed the Marchesa to a ramshackle stool, the only seat available. Just as she had predicted, the cognac was of the finest, and was clearly an illegal import, probably coming from Guernsey, where English taxes did not apply. However, after one glass, John grew anxious about Rose, who had been left in the carriage under the watchful eye of Jed, and he and Elizabeth made their way back. But they stopped short as they rounded the bend, and the coach came into their line of sight, for Rose was standing outside talking to a woman. The apothecary began to increase his stride, but Elizabeth laid her hand on his arm. "Don't, John. She's talking to a charmer." "A what?" "A wise woman. This one is a Romany, a gypsy. She won't do her any harm." John stared at the owner of tanned skin and black hair which had been plaited long and thick, hanging to the gypsy's waist. Into the plait she had woven flowers, while on her hip the woman carried a basket full of pegs, lace mats, lucky charms, and heather tied up in little bunches. Even while he watched, he saw her hand rose something, in response to which the child gave a polite bob. He would have called out, but yet again Elizabeth silenced him. "John, I told you, the woman is harmless. Rose is lucky to have been blessed by her." The sound of their voices must have carried on the breeze, because both the gypsy and John's daughter turned their heads in the direction of the newcomers. John caught a flash from eyes clear and fresh. Then the woman heaved up her basket and walked away, leaving Rose gazing at the object in her fist. "What did the charmer give you, sweetheart?" asked Elizabeth as they approached. "A good luck charm. See?" And she held out her hand. John stared at a tiny little doll, about 2 inches in length and made of old bits of material sewn together. "Oh, that looks interesting," was all he could think of saying. "She said it was very powerful and would protect me, that I must carry it always." "Well, then you must do so," John answered seriously. "I shall, Papa." She slid her hand into his. "She was nice, you know." "I'm sure she was. Did she tell you her name?" "Yes. It's Gypsy Orchard. She's on her way to Helstone to sell her wares." "We shall probably pass her on the way back." And they did. As the coach left Porthleven and headed for the Angel Inn, they saw the woman strolling down the lane, quite solitary, but singing to herself as she went. Rose leaned out and waved, and again John had a flash of those clear, wide eyes as Gypsy Orchard returned the salute. Chapter 6. It was the night before the floral dance, and the whole of the evening the town had been filling up with people, while the residents were busy decorating their houses with greenery and flowers. John, having put Rose to bed, had entrusted her into the care of Jed and Rufus, who were downstairs in the tap-room consuming ale, and had walked round Helstone with Elizabeth, who had linked her arm through his in a familiar fashion he had found extremely pleasing. Everywhere they looked, The citizens had been leaning from windows or shinning up ladders, adorning their dwelling places with boughs, floral tributes, or a proliferation of both. The effect of this was to fill the town with a fresh smell which he had found quite delicious. As they had promenaded, they had met several of the angel's other guests. First, they had seen Mrs. Legassick, accompanied by Mrs. Bligh. John, who had not met the other woman before, was amused to observe that she was much younger than her companion. Quite petite, with a very good figure and reasonably pretty hair, she clearly fancied herself as being extremely attractive to the opposite sex, and made much of curtsying, simultaneously casting her eyes upwards then over the apothecary. He could not resist kissing her hand and inquiring how she fared. "I am extremely well, sir. What fine company we have staying in our hotel, to be sure. Why, with you and Mr. Painter, I declare we hold the monopoly on the most handsome men in town." Mrs. Legassick had fluttered about. "Oh, cousin, how forward of you! Shame on you! Shame, I say!" Mrs. Bligh had given her an amused glance. "Come now, Muriel. You have the same thoughts, but are too nervous to voice them." "Oh, that, Tabitha! I should die of mortification to speak as freely as you do." "Oh, stuff!" All this was said in a light-hearted, bantering way, much to John's relief, and Elizabeth saved any potential embarrassment by laughing, though John suspected it was politeness which made her do so. However, at that moment, the two ladies were joined by two men, who hastened up to them through the crowd. "Ah, my dears, we are so glad we have found you. We asked for you at the Angel, but they said you were strolling through the streets." "Stroll in the streets," echoed the other man. "Oh, cousins, we're delighted to meet up with you." Mrs. Legassick turned to Elizabeth. "My dear Marchesa, may I present my cousins, Geoffrey and Gregory Colquite?" "Indeed you may." "Cousins, this is the Marchesa di Lorenzi." Mrs. Legassick said this with an awed sound in her voice, and John wondered that Elizabeth did not use her more important title of Lady Elizabeth. But she was a mettlesome woman, and probably would have taken any suggestion of that as foolish. The two male cousins bowed, then straightened simultaneously, giving the impression that they were marionettes. But other than their similarities of speech and movement, they could not have been more unalike. One was extremely tall, well over 6 foot, and with not a spare ounce of flesh on him anywhere. He was also, the apothecary thought, totally bald beneath his wig, which bestrode his dome uneasily, being somewhat on the tight side. The other man was quite short, not much over 5 foot, and inclined to be tubby. The tall man had a pair of spectacles which flashed over pale blue eyes. The short man had vivid brown eyes which sparkled as he spoke, which he now did. "My dear madam, it is a pleasure to be presented to you." "A pleasure," echoed the other one. They both bowed again, and Elizabeth swept a curtsy. "Gentlemen, the delight is mine." Mrs. Legassick spoke. "Let me explain our family. We are all Cornish men, and women, of course." She tittered noisily. "But both Mrs. Bligh and I married Englishmen who, alas, predeceased us. Consequently, we decided to pool our resources and share a home. The brothers Colquite are the sons of our Uncle Josiah, and we often see them when we come visiting Cornwall." "Where do you live?" asked John, curious. "In Wiltshire," Tabitha Bligh replied, twinkling her eyes and tossing her blonde head. "It's an awful journey for them," said the short, plump one, whom the apothecary had identified as Geoffrey. "In fact, we are determined for you both to move back here." "Move back," repeated Gregory. Mrs. Legassick neighed. "We shall have to wait and see about that." Elizabeth curtsied again. "If you will forgive us, we have to meet someone." There was a good deal of bobbing and bowing, but eventually the four moved off down the street. "Neatly done," said John appreciatively. I was afraid that we might find ourselves too long in their company. But they got no further in their walk, both of them stopping in their tracks to stare. For coming towards them was the exquisite Diana Warwick, in company with Tim Painter, who was doing his very best in the way of being charming. "And where is Mrs. Pill?" said Elizabeth under her breath. "Stuck with horrible little Isabel, I'll warrant," answered John, and burst out laughing. Seeing them, the couple stopped, and Tim gave the most elegant of bows. "Greetings, sir and madam. A fine night, is it not?" "Very fine, sir." "It should be good weather for the floral dance tomorrow," Diana ventured. "Certainly." "And how is Mrs. Pill?" asked Elizabeth, in that direct way of hers. Tim gave a careless laugh. "It seems little Isabel is unwell, and she is ministering to the invalid." John couldn't help but laugh in return. "Too much wandering round the corridors at night, I expect." "Indubitably. The child is an accomplished liar, by the way." Diana Warwick gave Tim a surprised glance. "How can you say that about your own daughter?" "She's nothing to do with me, madam. She is the offspring of old man Pill. She was 6 years old when I met her mother, but believe me, she grows nastier with each passing year." "Is Mrs. Pill then a widow?" This from Elizabeth. "Yes. Her husband was considerably older than she. He died when the child was 4. Leaving Mrs. Pill on the lookout for someone to take care of her, thought the apothecary. Not that he considered Tim Painter a good choice by any manner of means. Diana Warwick gave a truly delightful smile. "My, it's getting late. I suggest we cross the road, sir," she said, quite inconsequentially. Tim looked slightly startled as the beauty dropped a hasty curtsy and literally fled to the other side of the street. Bowing, he mumbled an apology and joined her. John stared at Elizabeth. "Well, I've seen some odd exits in my time, and that was certainly one of them." It was almost as if she had seen someone she was trying to get away from, the Marchesa answered thoughtfully. She stared up the street, but there was no one except a middle-aged man with a long wig and a great stick, somewhat old-fashioned in his garb, walking along quite alone. "Very strange," the apothecary replied. He offered Elizabeth his arm, and they continued on their way. After having wandered around for a while, strains of music filled their ears, and at the bottom of the town, where Coinage Hall Street sloped steeply away, they could see a crowd dancing. Elizabeth smiled. "I'll wager the monkey will do well tonight." And not only he. For sitting on a barrel outside the Blue Anchor, Gypsy Orchard was telling fortunes. "I must go and hear mine." "No," John answered, for ever since an old woman had foretold the death of Emilia, he had had a dread of such things. Elizabeth had given him a direct look. "If I didn't know you better, I would say you were afraid. Frankly, I fear what they will say. I'd rather you didn't go. But, my dear, I am determined. Go into the hostelry and drink some ale. I will cross the woman's palm with silver." John had no option but to comply, and went into the Blue Anchor, determined to belittle whatever it was that the gypsy foretold. Inside, somewhat to his surprise, he found Tim Painter, who had obviously abandoned Miss Warwick and gone in search of his own pleasures, sitting on a settle with a slim young man of about 20 years of age, who was squeezed up next to a fat man. They were both, judging by the look of them, well in their cups, and the apothecary thought that Mr. Painter must have downed several pints fast since being in the company of Diana Warwick. "How do?" said Tim companionably. He edged up on the wooden bench so that John had room to sit, somewhat uncomfortably. "What would you like to drink, sir?" John, feeling suddenly reckless, said, "A pint of ale, if you please." "Good choice, my friend, good choice. It's brewed on the premises, don't you know? Strong and powerful." He stood up and went in pursuit of a serving wench. The apothecary turned to the other man. "Good evening, sir. I'm afraid we haven't been introduced. Nicholas Kitto, sir, a native of Helstone." He attempted to rise in order to bow, but found himself incapable of movement, partly because the man on his right was so huge that had Nicholas relinquished the seat, he would never have been able to squeeze back in. John smiled sympathetically. "Rawlings, sir. John Rawlings, of London." "A pleasure to meet you, sir. You've travelled a long way to see the Furry Dance. Were you already in the area?" "I've been staying in Devon, but must soon head back to town, alas. But my companion insisted that I see this ancient tradition before I go." "How wise of him." "Her, actually." "Ah," Nicholas answered. John wondered momentarily whether he should say that Elizabeth was merely a friend, but decided that such a statement would appear gauche, as well as being totally untrue. He let the moment pass. Tim appeared with a wench bearing their order, and requesting the apothecary to move up, forced his way back onto the settle. "A health to all," he said, raising his glass. John, liking the man for all his obvious faults, did likewise. While he drank, he studied Nick, who had a certain indefinable air about him, though of what the apothecary was not certain. He was a good-looking young fellow, and had made an out-of-town effort with his clothes, which were reasonably cut, though of a hideous plum shade which clashed horribly with his red hair. In fact, he was pretty highly coloured, having bright pink cheeks and a great mass of freckles. Yet, despite these handicaps, he had an air of refinement, his features being clean-cut and rather becoming. John, watching him, wondered about the young man's parentage. But Tim was speaking. "Here's to both you good fellows. I've never met either of you before, but I feel as if we've always known one another." The apothecary, forcing his mind back to the present moment, gave a somewhat sickly grin, but Nicholas, who clearly lacked friends of his own age, responded with enthusiasm. "I'll drink to that, and gladly, sir." It was at that particular instant that John felt, rather than witnessed, the entire alehouse become quiet and somewhat tense. Turning, he saw that Elizabeth had walked in alone, enough to frighten the local population, and rising, he went immediately to her side to show that she was not unescorted. "Well?" he said. "Well, what? What did the gypsy have to say? Anything of interest?" He was looking directly into her face, treating the whole thing as a joke, or attempting to, and just for a split second he saw the expression in her eyes, dreamy yet alarmed, before the shutters came down, and she answered, "My dear, the usual stuff, that is all. But she amused me, so it was worth the money." He knew by her intonation that he would get no more out of her, so decided to play the game accordingly. "Did you buy any good luck charms?" "No, but she gave me this." Elizabeth held out her hand, and he saw a small hair, this one made of metal, unlike Rosie's little doll. "The golden hair," said the apothecary, picking it up. "Yes, she said to be careful of it," answered the Marchesa. She smiled. "Here, you have it." No, I'll buy one myself," John answered. "I insist. It's a present for you." "Very well. I accept. Thank you very much." And he tucked the hair away deep in a pocket. Bidding good night to Tim and Nicholas, who blushed a violent shade of red on seeing the Marchesa, they made their way out into Coinage Hall Street. But Gypsy Orchard had gone, and the crowds were beginning to thin out. Thinking to himself that Elizabeth was in an odd mood, brought on, no doubt, by having her fortune told, the apothecary walked quietly back to the Angel, where he wished her good evening, and went to his own room. Chapter 7. He was awoken at first light by the noise of drums beating out a strange and exotic rhythm, and for a moment or two John Rawlings lay quite still, thinking how pagan was the sound, and imagining primitive man worshipping the sun to such an insistent beat. The music struck a chord with some odd emotion within himself, and getting out of bed, dressed only in his nightshirt, he crossed to the window and threw back the shutters. Below him, in the street, he could make out the forms of several young men, each one carrying branches of red and white may-blossom. They were chanting the words of a strange song, and John threw up the shutters and put his head out, the better to listen. "Robin Hood and Little John, they are both gone to the fair, oh, and we will go to the merry green wood to see what they do there, oh, and for to chase the buck and doe, oh, with Halland Tow, jolly rumble, oh." So this was the famous Halland Tow song. Surely its similarity to a sea shanty, and the title itself, so reminiscent of heel and toe, were indicative of its origin. But the men were singing the chorus, and the apothecary craned his ears once more. "And we were up as soon as any day, oh, and for to fetch the summer home, the summer and the May, oh, for summer is a come, oh, and winter is a gone, oh." John stepped back into the room, wondering about the origins of both the Furry and the Halland Tow. One was a survivor of paganism, that much was certain, but exactly how and when it had started, neither he nor anyone else could be certain. He had heard several versions of the origin of the dance. One, that St. Michael had been engaged in an airborne battle with the devil for the possession of Helstone. Needless to say, the Archangel won, gaining his victory by throwing a stone at Satan, which caused him to fall, beaten, into Low Pool. The inhabitants, who were watching from below, danced with joy at this angelic triumph. Another version of this story told how the battle took place in France, causing St. Michael to retreat from his mount on that side of the channel to St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall. Satan, afraid of crossing the water, lifted off the lid of hell and hurled it at his adversary. Once again the missile missed, but fell right in the centre of Helstone, where, or so John had been reliably informed, it was to this day built into the wall of the Angel. There was even a third version, in which a fiery dragon passed over the town, slain, of course, by St. Michael. Washing in cold water and shaving as best he could, the apothecary dressed in workaday clothes, afraid of anything better getting damaged by the general high spirits of the crowd. Then he went next door to wake his daughter. She was not only up, but struggling into her clothes, a sight that touched him to the heart. He stood in silence for a moment, she unaware of his presence, and watched her wrestling with his dress. Then he coughed politely. Rose spun round and saw him. "Oh, Papa, did you hear the music? It's so exciting. I can't wait to go and see them." "Come here then, sweetheart. You're trying to get your arm through the neck opening. Let me help you." She stood still, but he could tell that she was seething with excitement, and as soon as he had fastened up the last button and put on her shoes, Rose headed for the door. End of Side 3. Side 4. "Wait a minute, child. Have you cleaned your teeth?" "No," she answered reluctantly. "Then kindly do so." And John handed her a little pot containing a mixture he had prepared himself, one of the main constituents of which was Portugal snuff and another gum myrrh. Rose hurried through the proceedings, then turned to the apothecary, breathing enthusiastically into his face. He waved a hand in front of his nose. "Very powerful. Now come along." As they passed the Marchesa's door, Rose asked, "Should we wake Mrs. Elizabeth?" "No, it's a little early. She'll come down when she's ready." So saying, they went into the street outside and looked around. A goodly collection of men and boys, the youngest being about 14 years of age, were heading up Coinage Hall Street, banging drums and various other noisy instruments. As well as bearing May blossom, they also had greenery in their hats, together with great smiles and a deal of noisy laughter. John, again struck by the primitive sight, listened to another verse of the song. "Where are those Spaniards that make so great a boast, oh? They shall eat the grey goose feather, and we will eat the roast, oh. In every land, oh, the land where'er we go, with a hallant tow, oh, jolly rumble, oh." So, there was a line in it that spoke of the Spanish Armada, while the grey goose feathers referred to the arrows of English archers. Like the bowmen of Agincourt, thought John, and felt patriotic and proud. On the opposite side of the street, he could see Catherine, Pill, and Isabel clapping their hands noisily and making much of waving at the group of singers. Standing a little further down from them were the four cousins, Muriel the Gassick, Tabitha Bligh, together with Gregory and Geoffrey Colquite. They seemed to have gathered several friends with them, including one large lady with a sweep of white hair beneath a huge hat, and very large, very sensual eyes. She caught the apothecary gazing at her, and gave him a slow, secretive smile. Slightly disconcerted, John looked away. Isabel was making the usual fuss, refusing to hold her mother's hand and stamping her foot. Even while he watched her, the child twisted out of Mrs. Pill's grip and ran into the crowd of singers, joining in their song, with a la-la sung hopelessly out of tune. "Isabel, come here!" shouted the mother, but to no avail. The child continued to dance along with the men, some of whom were annoyed, one or two smiling with embarrassment, but the majority frankly angry. "Trust her," said John. A big lad, tall and well-built, leant down to the girl and said, "Move along, little lady. This be a man's dance," and he put his hand on her shoulder. What happened next was unbelievable. Isabel turned on him like a savage dog and sunk her teeth into his flesh, drawing blood. The man let out a howl of pain and moved rapidly away, at which several others of the band of singers turned on the child. "Out, you little witch! Be off with you before we call the constable!" Isabel stood there, looking defiant. Then she poked out her tongue to its full length and ran as fast as her legs could carry her down the hill, out of Coinage Hall Street, and off in the general direction of Low Pool. Catherine, after a moment's hesitation, followed in pursuit, shrieking, "Come here, Isabel! Come here!" John, glad that he had Rose with him, and a valid excuse not to join in the chase, said, "What a perfectly horrible child!" "I'm not like that, am I, Papa?" "Not in the least, I'm delighted to say." He picked Rose up and swung her onto his shoulders. "There. Can you see better?" "Yes. Shall we follow the singers?" "We certainly shall." "Won't Mrs. Elizabeth wonder where we are?" "We'll go back soon and have breakfast with her." "Oh, good. Do you like her, Papa?" How to explain to a young child that he had fallen in love with the Marchesa and was determined to somehow or other persuade her to marry him? Impossible, thought John, and simply answered, "Yes, very much. I like her too." But John was no longer concentrating, having just caught sight of Tim Painter making his way up the street at a strolling pace. So, he had been down at the far end all along, unless he had joined Catherine when she had gone running down in pursuit of Isabel. But if that were the case, why had he come back alone? And where were the other two? Had he been on his own, the apothecary would have investigated further, but a pressure on his shoulders told him that Rose was desperate to follow the singers. So, with one final look in Tim's direction, John complied and went marching off up the street towards the school. Breakfast was a hasty affair, because Elizabeth was anxious to join the festivities, and she was not to be disappointed. As soon as they got into the street, the notes of a solitary fiddle were heard clearly on the morning air, and who should come into their line of vision but the blind fiddler himself, leading a long line of dancers making their way through the narrow alleyways hand in hand. The dance itself was graceful and dignified, the dancers walking forward, then the men changing places and turning the female partner of the other man before they changed places once again and turned their original partner. But it was to the curious habit of dancing in and out of houses, which stood open and welcoming, that John's eyes were drawn. The dancers entered by one door and left by another, never wavering in their steps, and all the while the fiddler, assisted by Gideon, the thin young tambourine player, and the monkey, drew them on through the town. "Who leads the dancers?" John asked a local fellow who was watching the line of swirling people. "Helstone folk, born and bred. The lady's always the most recent bride. There's a deal of jealousy about the man, though. It's supposed to be the most important person, but everyone thinks that role applies to him. I've known men fight over the honour." The apothecary grinned. "I can imagine." "I'll wager that some get married the day before the festivities in order to fit the bill," Elizabeth put in. "Aye, that and all," the man answered. John ran his eye over the spectators, who had been growing steadily in number. He could see Mrs. Legassick and Mrs. Bligh, together with the Colquites and their other friends, including the large lady with the white hair and soulful eyes, all standing together and cheering everyone on. There was no sign of Mrs. Pill, or Tim, or little Isabel, come to that, but the beautiful Diana Warwick, dressed finely and causing quite a stir, had sallied forth alone and stood quietly viewing the passing parade. And it was at that moment that John had the strangest feeling that all was not well, that something somewhere was amiss. He had had these premonitions before, several times, and knew how dangerous it was to ignore them. He turned to Elizabeth. "My dear, will you look after Rose for me? I just want to go and have a look round." She shot him a questioning glance, but said nothing. "All right. Of course I will. Will you be long?" "About 30 minutes, an hour at the most. I just feel I should. Do you understand?" "No, but Rose and I will be all right, won't we?" She bent down to the child, who, for answer, planted a kiss on her cheek and went on watching the dance. "Allow me to do the same," John said, and briefly embraced the Marchesa. Then, turning, he hurried down Coinage Hall Street towards the fields that lay at the end. As he went, he tried to rationalize his thoughts. Why should he have had that unwelcome but familiar feeling that all was not well? And what was it that made his footsteps lead him out of town towards the fields that lay at the bottom? He had no answers, but only a determination to discover all that he could. He walked on for another 10 to 15 minutes, then stopped, amazed. He was looking at one of the largest lakes he had ever seen in the West Country. The low pool, a misnomer if ever there was one, glinted serenely in the sun, but John had been told that at times the mountainous scenes broke over Low Bar and into the pool, flooding the Cover Valley as far as Helstone. It was easy to see at those times that the town had once had its own port, but this had silted up long ago, and now the nearest point to the sea was Porthleven. The place, as far as he could see, was utterly deserted. Not a soul about. Wondering how the search for Isabel had concluded, the apothecary walked slowly round the pool, a very goodly stretch, wishing that this strange feeling of dread would dissipate. Eventually, though, he tired of wandering aimlessly and set direction for Coinage Hall Street once more. He had reached the bottom of it when he heard the sound of running feet, and Tim Painter, sweating slightly and not looking as calm and collected as usual, came panting down. "Have you seen Isabel?" he asked abruptly. The apothecary's fears returned. "Not since this morning, no. Well, the little bitch has vanished, and her mother is in a high hysteric. I tell you, I'll wring that child's neck when I catch up with her." John cast his mind back to the earlier scene, seeing again the look of anguished surprise on the face of the young male dancer and the spiteful expression on that of little Isabel. "She went running away towards the meadows and beyond. But I've just come from there, and there's nobody around. The place is deserted. Don't worry. We've searched the area high and low, and she's not there. Her mother is even suggesting that some brave chap dives in the pool and looks for a body." John frowned, thinking to himself that the lake was vast and wondering where a diver would begin. Tim looked at the town, which had filled up with even more people since John had left it. "And who are we going to get to do it on a day like this? You can see for yourself that it's a public holiday," he said. "Have you informed the constable?" "No, not yet. I doubt that he's on duty either." "Constables are always on duty," John answered severely. "Well, will you go and find him? I'm too busy searching." Everything inside the apothecary rebelled at the very idea, but his sense of responsibility battled with the emotion until he eventually said, "Oh, all right. Thanks, old chap. I'll continue the hunt for the horror, and she'll feel the back of my hand when I catch up with her." "A good plan," said John with feeling, and continued up the road. Chapter 8. It seemed that there was to be no let-up in the festivities. The dancers continued on, the fiddler now being joined by the rest of his musicians, who played the rousing tune with great enthusiasm. The monkey, sent round once more with the hat, returned with it full, and realizing it had done well, chattered enthusiastically. John, fighting his way through the crowd, which was building up to enormous proportions, eventually managed to find Elizabeth and Rose. "I'm sorry I was so long, but something fairly annoying has happened." "What?" "I met Tim Painter, and Isabel has vanished." "Dreadful child. When was she last seen?" "Apparently it was this morning. In fact, I witnessed her departure. She flew off down the street towards the meadows and possibly Low Pool, and has disappeared without trace." "What caused her to go?" "She bit one of the Halland towmen on the hand, and I think she was afraid that someone was going to punish her, so she fled, with her mother in hot pursuit, I might add." "And now nobody can find her?" "Correct. Anyway, I promised Tim that I would tell the constable for him." Elizabeth pulled a face. "Who is he? Do you know?" "I'm afraid I haven't an idea. That's another bit of research I must undertake." "Well, Rose and I were going off to get refreshment. We can ask along the way." They all set off in the direction John had just come from, and by the time they had reached the Angel, had discovered that the constable was a local blacksmith named William Trethowan. They were further informed that he would no doubt be in the Blue Anchor at this hour. John looked apologetic. "It's not really a suitable place for a child. Do you mind if I go alone?" "As long as you promise to catch up with me later." "What are your plans?" "Rose and I are going to wander through the town and watch the faddy." "What's that?" "It's what they call the line of dancers. I should imagine it comes from Old English, when fada mean to go." Rose spoke for the first time. "Well, I'm glad Isabel has fadded. She won't come and stare at me at night now." "She'll probably be back before bedtime, but I'll make sure she leaves you alone." "She'll be too tired by then anyway, Papa." "Very true," said John. He bent down and kissed his daughter. "Look after Mrs. Elizabeth for me." And he was off, heading purposefully for the Blue Anchor. Somewhat to his surprise, he found the constable straight away. The chap was in the tap-room, holding forth about something or other, and was clearly as drunk as a lord already. Having bought himself a pint of ale to steady his nerves, John approached with a certain trepidation. The constable, who was enormously tall and broad, a veritable giant of a fellow, bent his head down and said, "What do you want, little man?" "To speak to you, if I may, sir." Trethowan roared with laughter. "Well, of course you can speak. The question is, will I listen?" This brought a chorus of belly laughs from the other occupants of the bar, all of whom were well the worse for drink. John decided that the only thing to do was to act mysteriously. "I've a tale to tell, sir. A tale of a terrible child and what might have befallen her." "Taken off by a bad man, was she?" said somebody. "Shush!" demanded Trethowan. "I want to hear." Well, at least he'd caught his attention, thought John. "This girl is a stranger to these parts, and went to see the Halland Toe this morning. Anyway, little monster that she is, she insisted on joining in, and when the men remonstrated with her, she bit one of them on the hand. Then, when they turned on her, she ran down the street in the direction of the fields, possibly towards Low Pool, and hasn't been seen since. So I thought, sir, as you are the constable, you ought to be told." There was silence in the room for a second, and then the blacksmith burst out laughing. "So, a child has gone missing, has she? I'd like a sovereign for every young un that gets lost on Flora Day, so I would." He paused, drank half a tankard of ale in a swallow, then bent down to the apothecary once more. "Tell you what, my friend, if she's still lost tomorrow morning, then come and see me, and I'd organise a search. Meanwhile, may I suggest that you go and enjoy the rest of the day as I intend to do. Goodbye." And he turned his large back. John felt utterly deflated. His mysterious ploy had failed dismally, and now he was left with no alternative but to limp back to the Angel with his tail between his legs. He bought himself another pint of ale for consolation, and went to sit in a dark corner to think about the situation. But he had no time to get very far, for the door to the tap-room opened, and there were the brothers Colquhoun, with the two other men the apothecary had noticed earlier. Snatches of their conversation drifted towards him. "There's enough to form a—" This last word said very low, so that it was impossible to hear. "But what about the—" John could not catch the rest. "Nonsense!" This from Geoffrey Colquhoun. "Let us proceed as planned." "Oh, well, you always were—" At that moment they were disturbed by the arrival of a potboy, and that particular conversation ceased, though one voice continued talking loud and enthusiastic rubbish. John drank up and walked out past the quartet. They greeted him as if he were a long-lost brother, calling him over and bowing most politely. "My dear sir, how very nice to see you." "Nice to see you," echoed Gregory. "May I present even more cousins, Eustace Sayce and Herbert Rees." A couple of males rose and bowed. One was short and round, with a face like a grinning red melon. He was the one who had been conversing noisily, and now he winked at the apothecary and rolled his eyes. He obviously considered himself a character, and wanted everyone else to do so as well. The other was very small, almost dainty, with tiny little hands and feet. They were, all things considered, a very ill-matched duo. John bowed politely and made small talk, but eventually extricated himself and headed off for the Angel, thinking deeply. His main thought was about the actual role of constable. It was generally a detested occupation, compulsory and unpaid, so much so that several citizens appointed a deputy to do the job for them. This had resulted in the formation of a class of men, mostly illiterate, and existing on the pittance paid them by their employers, who had become professional deputies. Some, indeed, held the office for many years, going from one employer to the next as the obligatory year came to an end. And it seemed to the apothecary that Helstone's constable resented the job tremendously. Indeed, it may well be true that children were lost during the floral dance. Considering the crowds who watched it, it seemed more than likely. But, for all that, John had found his attitude patronizing and pretentious. At the very least, he could have organized a search for the missing Isabel. John believed that she was probably hiding in the woods near Low Pool, and that she would come out when things got quiet and she grew hungry. The best idea was to enjoy the rest of the day. With this thought uppermost in his mind, he whistled his way into the Angel to discover a scene taking place in the dining parlour. Mrs. Pill was in floods of tears and refusing to be comforted by anybody. One look was enough to send John up to his room to fetch his medical bag. He returned and studied the situation. Tim Painter had given up and was taking the opportunity to give Diana Warwick, who sat serene and lovely and a little bit remote, the eye. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Rose watched fascinated, but did not attempt to interfere. This was being done by Mrs. Legassick, who held the semi-swooning woman in a tight embrace. The female whom John had noticed earlier, namely, she of the large frame and succulent eyes, was also comforting Mrs. Pill. Indeed, she looked up as the apothecary entered the room, attempting to appear professional. "Shush, my dear. I think this gentleman is a doctor," said Mrs. Legassick. "I am an apothecary, actually, madam. Now, Mrs. Pill, let me have a look at you." He knelt beside the fainting woman, acutely aware that the large lady was watching him with a positively lecherous expression on her face. Fortunately, Isabel's mother was too far gone to put up much resistance, and swallowed a measure of physic that the apothecary guided towards her mouth. "There, that should calm her. One of your magic potions." It was the big woman speaking. "But excuse me, sir. Allow me to present myself. I am Anne Anstey. I'm so interested in the apothecary's art. My late husband was one of your brotherhood, you know." "Charmed, madam. My name is John Rawlings," John answered briefly, peering intently into Mrs. Pill's face, which was utterly drained of colour. Suddenly, and rather shockingly, her eyes flew open and stared into his. "She's drowned," she hissed in a thrilling sibilant. "My girl's drowned, and I know it." The thought that the apothecary had resolutely been pushing away ever since he had seen Low Pool now came surging back. "Nonsense, my dear," said Mrs. Anstey. "She'll be home soon as it gets dark. They don't like being out after dusk, do little girls." But John, thinking of the size of Low Pool and guessing at its depth, thought of little Isabel, and knew that whatever faults the child might have had, she did not deserve a fate like that. "Tell me," he said gently, "exactly what happened today. Explain to me what you saw." The physic was obviously starting to take effect, because Mrs. Pill was visibly starting to relax. The weeping had stopped, and along with it the high, hysterical voice. Indeed, her speech was now quite quiet and slow. "As I think you saw, Mr. Rawlings, Isabel ran away from me down the street. I followed, but being older, I can't run as fast as she. Further, my clothes impeded me. In any case, I saw her sprint into the fields at the street's end. Then I briefly lost sight of her as she disappeared into some trees, but then I saw her again as she hurried on. To cut to the heart of the matter, I had some difficulty getting to the pond because of the marshy land surrounding the cova, but I managed to make my way round it, and there lay this enormous lake." "Tell me, did you see Isabel there?" No. I feel that she had already fallen in by the time I got there." "But you have nothing to prove that. It's only what you suspect." "Come now, Catherine. We walked right round the lake, a distance of about 5 miles, I might add, and nowhere was there a sign of anyone having fallen in. It is all in your imagination, I swear it." Tim Paynter had joined them and was doing his best to cheer up his light of love. Mrs. Pill shook her head. "I know that she has gone. You cannot deny a mother's instinct." "I'm not denying it, but I think you're wrong," Tim answered impatiently, and John caught himself thinking that the man was hardly sympathetic. He cleared his throat. "Madam, if I might suggest you retire and have a rest. I have informed the constable of the turn of events, and he has agreed to organize a search tomorrow. But it is his contention that Isabel will return before nightfall, and I think that there is a good chance that he might be right." Catherine made signs that she wanted to rise, and Anne Anstey heaved her to her feet. "Now you get some sleep, Mrs. Pill, my dear. I promise to be here when you wake up again." John asked, "Would you like me to accompany you to your room?" "No, I shall be perfectly all right. I'll just go down for an hour or two." And with that she staggered out, accompanied by the ever-present Mrs. Anstey. Elizabeth looked directly at John. "What are the chances of the child having fallen in?" He raised his shoulders. "How would I know? The pool is certainly large and deep, but without any evidence one could not possibly say. But what do you really think?" "I shall wait and see if she returns before I say anything further." Tim Painter spoke up. "Well, now that she's gone, I think Catherine might well be right. I mean, where did the child disappear to? She hasn't been seen since this morning, and that is a long time ago now." The three of them stared at each other helplessly, and it was at this moment that there was a movement in the doorway. Turning, they saw the constable, breathing hard and somewhat red in the face. "Ah, sir," he said, advancing on John. "Wasn't it you who came to report a missing child earlier?" "Yes, that's right. Why, do you have news of her?" "Yes, sir, I do. She, or a child answering her description, has been seen. But I didn't give you her description," the apothecary answered. "Nevertheless, she's been spotted." "Where?" asked Tim Painter. "Up in the town, beyond the school and close to the church." "What was she doing?" asked Elizabeth. The constable roared with laughter. "Why, bless you all, she was dancing, of course." John was not sure who ran the faster, him or Tim Painter. Panting up the street to where the Guildhall stood, they turned left into the steeply sloping lane that led to the church. They pounded down this, going as fast as they could, at the same time calling out, "Isabel, where are you?" There was no answer, but they did not let that deter them. Instead, they ran towards the holy building, and only slowing their steps slightly, sprinted the last few yards over open country to where the church stood serenely in its own grounds. "Do we go in?" asked Tim. "Of course. She might well be hiding inside." Removing their headgear, which both men had thrust on before they started to run, they proceeded in through the door in the porch. Immediately, the atmosphere of the church made them walk quietly and speak in subdued voices. There was no one in sight, but a step behind them had them spinning round hopefully. An elderly cleric stood there, sweet-faced and very kindly in appearance. He seemed astonished to see anyone, and John realized that after the morning service very few people must visit the church on Flora Day. He made a formal bow. "Good day to you, sir." "Good day, young man." Tim Painter gave a lazy bow. "How do?" he said. "Have you by any chance seen a young girl, aged about 7? She has a mop of dark hair and was heading for the church when last observed." "Yes," said the vicar, surprisingly. "A child answering that description was hiding in here, but ran out when she saw me." "How long ago was that?" This from Tim Painter. "About 15 minutes or so. She can't have got far." "Thank you 1,000 times," said John. "If you don't mind, we'll go in pursuit." "I'm glad I was of service. I hope to see you in church sometime." "Oh, you will," the apothecary called over his departing shoulder. Tim Painter, on the other hand, raised his hat, but said nothing. Chapter 9. They ran out and back to the Guildhall as quickly as they had come. John, panting somewhat, looked at Tim, and thought to himself that the fellow was in the peak of condition, lean and fit, and not in the least out of breath. Painter, aware that he was being stared at, gave the apothecary the familiar idle smile and said, "When I get my hands on that little bitch, I'll give her a lesson she won't forget in a hurry." John slowed his pace. "You don't like the child, do you?" Tim chuckled, sounding quite human. "I can't stand her. In fact, I've disliked her ever since I first saw her." "Then why?" "Money, old boy. Mrs. Pill is damnable rich. Old man Pill was a wealthy merchant, and when he shuffled off, his widow gained the lot. Now, I'm quite happy to admit I'm delighted to be a kept man. It seems to me that work is something to be avoided if at all possible. By the way, you surprised me today. I had no idea you were an apothecary. Really? Well, I have been since I was 16. What do you mean? Well, that's how old I was when I began my indentures. John allowed a small smile to cross his features as he thought of his old master. But Tim was continuing to talk. Anyhow, that wily old bird, Pill, left a clause in his will that means his widow loses all her money should she remarry. So I have to remain the perpetual lover, which is wretchedly tiring, let me assure you. John could not help but grin at the frankness with which it was all said. Then he thought of Elizabeth, of her strangely beautiful face with its ugly scar, of her strong, almost masculine body, of the thrall she held him in, and determined to regularize their situation. As if reading his thoughts, Painter said, "That's a handsome piece you're involved with. What exactly is your relationship?" John gave him an amused glance. "We're close friends. That is all." "All?" "Yes," the apothecary answered shortly, and let the matter drop. They had been searching while they spoke, going up to the top of the town until it vanished into trees and countryside. There was no sign of Isabel, but undeterred, knowing that she could not be far away, they came back and searched the length of Meneague Street. The crowd had now thinned, and the dancing had ceased in this particular spot. John, looking at his watch, saw that it was 3 o'clock, and realized that the gentryfolk had all gone to tea. Distantly, he could hear the sound of the Cornish Fiddler, as he had come to think of the man, but all was quiet elsewhere. "Where is the wretched girl?" Tim asked in exasperation. "Probably back in the bosom of her mother by now. Well, I suggest we return to the Angel and have some ale. I'm sick to infirmity of looking for the child." "So am I," answered John, feeling tired and longing to sit with Elizabeth and just talk. They exchanged a glance and then went into the hostelry. End of Side 4.